Hi, my name is Paul Lanzi, and I'm the COO and co-founder of Remediant. I'm actually really excited to be chatting with you today about how we can shift PAM projects into high gear using the concepts of zero standing privilege. Now, back in 1914, this is what counted as high gear. We would say it was horse gear back in 1914. This is how you went fast. So a horse, a buggy, and a driver. This is how you got going where you needed to be. And there was a lot of different attributes that you might use to evaluate one horse driver versus another, whether one used dual braided ropes or whether one used 36-inch diameter wheels or whether one had chosen to name their horse Fancy. But at the end of the day, those weren't really the attributes that mattered for winning, because at the end of the day, the only thing that mattered for winning the race was who was first over the finish line. And that's true whether we're talking about GT40s or horses and buggies. It's really, in racing, the goal is very clear. It's who's the first over the finish line. And it would be so nice if things were so clear in the information security world as well, where our objectives for information security projects were just that crisp. But when we think about privileged access management projects, one of the challenges is that different departments might have different goals for why you're doing a privileged access management project in the first place. Some departments might be trying to satisfy some compliance requirements, whether the HIPAA or CMMC or some other compliance requirements. Other departments might be trying to improve their DevSecOps productivity, especially those departments that are brand new to picking up and using those DevSecOps principles. Managing the privilege access and making sure that the DevSecOps engineers have the privilege access they need when they need it is a critical reason for some organizations to do PAM projects. Other organizations might be trying to mitigate some sort of ransomware threat. When we look at the way that ransomware spreads today, it almost always relies on compromising some sort of privileged account. And so a lot of PAM projects out there have been stood up in order to mitigate the threat of ransomware, which is a major risk today in today's information security ecosystems. Now, I would posit, though, that there is one goal hiding underneath all of these other top-level goals, and that's that you're trying to reduce the impact of compromised admin credentials. If you assume for a minute that admin credentials are going to be compromised at some point, somehow one of the administrator's usernames and passwords is going to be compromised, the real objective here would be to try and keep those compromised credentials from being used for the attacker to be able to move laterally within the network. So lateral movement is one of the big things that we're trying to mitigate, and the way that we do that is by reducing the impact of those compromised admin credentials. Again, an underlying idea behind a lot of the reasons why an organization might be doing a PAM project. So we talked earlier about some things that maybe didn't matter so much for evaluating one horse driver versus another. It doesn't really matter if they use dual braided rope or what they've named their horse. And when we think about shifting PAM projects into high gear, there's a lot of other attributes about the PAM tools that you probably can also skip over. Things like what level of bit encryption they're using for password storage and how many sessions at once they can do, how many times a day they rotate their passwords. These are actually not the attributes that you should be looking at if you're trying to accelerate your PAM project and create a PAM solution for your enterprise that's going to work really broadly. So let's think about what are some of the things that might be valuable attributes to look at for the PAM tools if you care most about getting a PAM project that is effective, efficient, and rolled out quickly. I think it comes back to thinking about the core goal, which is to reduce the impact of compromised admin credentials. And I think this really breaks down into two sub-problems. The first one is understanding scope. Now, as a former IT project manager myself, I love thinking about scope. And the tighter the scope and the more concrete the scope, the better odds you've got of having a successful project. So really, from a scope perspective, the first question you need to ask yourself is, what admin credentials exist today? How does my security ecosystem look right now before I even started the PAM project? And then think about what the real objective here, which is how do you protect those admin rights from the potential for abuse and the use of lateral movement? So let's dig into this a little bit more. What admin credentials exist today turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question to answer at any sort of scale, right? So if you only have one administrator in your ecosystem and they have rights on everything, that's a fairly easy question to answer. But as soon as you get larger than that, and especially if you're talking about dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people that might have admin rights on some set of systems across your ecosystem, this gets extremely difficult to answer. One of the things that makes this difficult to answer is the scale, but one of the unappreciated parts of why this is so difficult to answer is that rights change over time, and they change constantly in ways that are not really obvious to most observers in the information security world. Things that can cause administrator rights to change over time, things like group membership changes, right? So groups are constantly being added, modified, removed, etc. As those Active Directory groups change, they confer privileged access to different sets of users across different sets of computers. And those group memberships are changing constantly. Another thing that causes this to change constantly is the creation and the removal of local accounts that have privileged access. So your directory is keeping track of your directory accounts and your directory groups, but it doesn't know anything about the local accounts that live on individual computers across your environment. And those local accounts can and often do have administrator rights on those systems. And then GPOs is another significantly underappreciated cause for a lot of change in privileged access across large swaths of systems over time. As those GPOs change and users and groups are granted or removed rights, you can see privileged access change over time. So really what we need here is some sort of continuous detection mechanism. Because looking at point-in-time snapshots of who has privileged access where are going to be, at best, incomplete, and at worst, they're going to just be flat wrong. So what you're seeing here is a graph that shows over the course of around 5 months or so, the change in privileged access for just one computer. Now, this is an environment that had around 10,000 computers or so, and we just chose to look at one computer, but you can see here that just in a 28-day period, they had 100% change in the privileged access on that one system. And that's actually fairly typical, and that's often surprising, especially to IT project managers that are trying to plan out their PAM projects, to learn that they're trying to hit a moving target, right? So the privileged access management that they're tasked with securing is not a static set, it's constantly changing, and this is a diagram that shows just how much it changed for this one computer over that 128-day period. So we talked about some attributes, not so important attributes for privileged access management tool selection, but I do think that we can put on the list here our list of important attributes. The first one can be admin rights scan frequency. Because you're going to need to be continuously assessing who has privileged access where, tuning into the frequency with which the tool is capable of giving you that information is a key selection attribute for your privileged access management tool. Now, ideally, you're also wanting this scan to happen automatically, and you're wanting it to happen frequently. When we started talking with our first customer, they were looking for this frequency to happen roughly once a week or so, right? That was their objective, was automatically and once a week. Remediant's technology is actually capable of scanning multiple times per day, and in smaller environments, potentially even more than that, with a very light lift without installing agents on the endpoint. So using those as selection criteria for your tools, very important. All right, now let's think about a little bit about this concept of lots of admin rights. So when we look across large enterprises in the real world, in aggregate, we find lots of admin rights. Now, this is an environment with around 51,000 computers or so. And if you look at this graph, you'll see that in this particular environment, there were over 7,000 computers that had between 700 and 800 admin accounts. Now, this is an organization where the entire IT department's only about 150 people. So it means that admin rights were being granted to not just the folks within the IT team, and potentially, there's IT team members that probably didn't need admin rights, but to lots of other accounts as well. And they had no idea that they had quite so much privileged access across their ecosystem until we were able to do that scan and assess. Now, this is a particularly large number of accounts with privileged access on a particularly large number of systems, but it's actually not unusual to find cases like this where, because of group membership or other reasons, large numbers of accounts have lots of privileged access across large swaths of the ecosystem. So I want to introduce this new term for you called standing privilege, and I can't take credit for creating this one. This actually came from your Gartner analysts. But the idea that privilege access tends to accrete over time, and when that persistent privilege access is there 24/7, meaning that those accounts or those groups are granted privilege access forever, we call that standing privilege. So standing privilege, that basically just means accounts with continuous privilege in the form of privileged group memberships or static rules, including local accounts, that allow the execution of privileged commands. So it's a pretty broad term, but it's a great way to think about how much privilege access is out there today, right? What am I, IT project manager doing a PAM project or information security system solution implementer, trying to solve for within the privilege access management ecosystem for this particular organization? Now, it does also tend to accrete over time. Privilege access tends not to go down. So when we think about this particular example, when we look across their entire ecosystem, this is roughly 21 million standing privilege rights across their roughly 51,000 computers. So if you take up all the privilege access on each of those 51,000 computers and add it all up, you come up with something like 21 million standing privilege access rights. Now, this is pretty bad, but some organizations we work with are even worse, where something similar might be hundreds of millions of standing privilege access rights, and some are much worse than that. So the first really thing to think about is, how do you get a handle on this? And so we can put on our list of important attributes a tool that's also able to show you how much standing privilege there is in your environment. And again, getting back to that first point, that visualization should be updated with some frequency, and it should be updated automatically. So this is great. Now we've got a handle on what's the size of the problem we're trying to solve. Is it a breadbasket or is it a semi-truck? How big is the privilege access accretion problem within our ecosystem? So understanding the scope of the problem is really the first step. The next step is really coming in and trying to solve that problem. And this is where we introduce another new term called zero standing privilege. And I can take no more credit for this one than I could for the concept of standing privilege. But the idea of zero standing privilege is the elimination of standing privilege and moving toward a just-in-time basis for admin rights. And this helps to ensure that the principle of least privilege is observed, because it limits to the authorized users only the minimum rights for the minimum amount of time on the minimum set of assets. And this zero standing privilege concept and the enforcement of just-in-time access is how we can mitigate the risk of all that standing privilege that's out in the environment today. So let's dig into this a little bit more. So in practice, this is an example of a single computer and how its privilege access changed over this several-month period. Now, in a zero standing privilege world, instead of this being between 35 and 80 accounts that have privilege access on this particular system, you would bring this down to zero, right? So you just bring that whole graph right on down to zero privilege access on that system. So no users have persistent privilege access on this system. And when we look across an entire ecosystem, again, this is showing 51,000 computers across a medium-sized enterprise, what you would see is all these numbers, all these bars would go down to zero as well. So basically showing that there's no standing privilege across that ecosystem. Now, this also turns out to be an excellent measure for when your PAM project is done. So if you can obtain zero standing privilege across all the assets in your ecosystem, then you definitely know that your privilege access project has successfully completed. So we'll keep that in mind. We're going to come back and talk more about the success measures for privilege access management projects. But in practice, this is what zero standing privilege actually looks like across a medium-sized enterprise. So let's talk a little bit more about privilege access, right? So we used to joke that you can tell it's more reliable than the HR record for how long someone's been in a company is how much privilege access they've managed to accrete. Privilege access tends to be granted for special projects, for role assignments, role changes, that sort of thing, but it's rarely removed, right? So even organizations that have a great IGA program for role management tend not to think about privilege access as one of the things that's within the scope of their IGA. And so privilege access just tends to go up and up and up over time. We also see cases where local accounts are granted privilege access on different systems, and the passwords for those local accounts just happens to be the same across multiple systems to make things easier for IT help desk or other administrators. And that's another case where privilege access is very broadly granted. So what we really want to do is enforce the concept of zero standing privilege in order to mitigate that risk across the entire ecosystem of lateral movement. So we want to move from a world where privilege access is granted with continuous privilege, meaning standing privilege or 24/7 persistent rights, and privilege access accretes over time, and where it's granted by an IGA but never really taken away, or group memberships that aren't ever revoked. All those things are creating that lateral movement risk. We want to move away from that world and move toward a world where privilege access is granted on a just-in-time basis. And that's the perfect way to achieve the principle of least privilege. So privilege access rights exist only when they're actually needed, right? So the accounts are there, but they don't have that privilege access until they actually need that privilege access. And then it's granted only for a limited period of time and only on a limited set of assets, whatever the set of assets, the minimum set of assets that's needed in order to perform whatever privileged activity it was that the operator needed to do. This is how we can also keep things from accreting over time, because if the privilege access automatically goes away at the end of that time, then the privilege access will never just keep accreting. You'll always have as close to zero standing privilege as you possibly can. We also want to make sure that the privilege access is granted only by the PAM tool, so that the PAM tool can also enforce any cases where unauthorized privilege access is detected, and the PAM tool should be responsible for removing that unauthorized standing privilege access. This keeps you from having orphan accounts with privilege access, and is a great way of mitigating that movement of lateral movement risk using privileged access. So providing just-in-time access is another core capability of PAM tools when you're selecting PAM tools for your PAM project. So we've talked a lot about how you can help think about zero standing privilege in both your tool selection and your project planning process. But let's move on to actual project execution. So I think that we all get excited when the race actually begins, right? So you've got your project authorized, you've done your tool selection. Now let's think about some ways that we can bring the concepts of zero standing privilege into the project execution. Now, the first thing is leveraging those three key attributes we talked about earlier for tool selection and bringing those into the project execution process. We can use those same three attributes. So when we think about admin rights scan frequency, it's really critical. We actually had one customer whose PAM implementation won an internal award for most impactful project because they were able to show how over time the admin rights had been accreting up. And then after they deployed the PAM tool, the admin rights were down to zero and then stayed there for a very long period of time. And then that's why they won this award for most impactful project, was to show that they had had a substantial improvement in the security ecosystem for the entire company. So this admin rights scan frequency is pretty critical. During project execution, if you are doing this correctly, if you are scanning and modifying your view of the privilege access across the ecosystem, it can tell you if you're moving in the right direction. If you're in the middle of the project execution and you're seeing admin rights go up, you know that something is leaking, that you've got something that you need to modify about your PAM project implementation. The other really big benefit here is that you, as a project team, can actually be improving the security ecosystem during the project. So many of our information security projects rely on a big bang at the end of the project, where you don't really see any improvement in the security ecosystem during the project, and only at the very conclusion of the project does something magic happen, and now the security of the organization is improved. But by adopting the concepts of zero standing privilege and continuously monitoring for changes in privilege access, you can actually start reducing the risk of the most impactful computers, the most impactful accounts as well during the project. And so you actually can start showing improvements in the security ecosystem literally from the first day of the project all the way through to the conclusion. So huge security benefit there from taking this approach. The next thing is to show the standing privilege access. Now, I would encourage you to show the standing privilege access pretty broadly. So show it to your stakeholders, show it to your information security leaders, show it to other IT project managers. Within your internal organization, share this pretty broadly, because it can tell a really good story about the risk posed by standing privilege access and what the project is going to do to improve that. So it also helps you with your project planning. So again, former IT project manager here, I love having a really crisp project scope. Understanding the amount of privilege access you're trying to mitigate is a great way of understanding your project scope. It also helps to set stakeholder expectations, right? So they can get their minds wrapped around the fact that we have, say, 21 million standing privilege access rights across our ecosystem, and that's a really big number. We need to reduce that by something like 99%. That's a very crisp way of communicating project value to the stakeholders and setting their expectations about what you're going to be coming back to them with as far as modifications to their standard operating procedures. The last one here is around the capability of providing just-in-time access. Now, a lot of our information security projects out there don't win us a lot of friends, right? So they make something or a lot of things more difficult for the users or more difficult for the technical staff inside the company. Now, I would say that just-in-time access is an exception to that, and their lives can actually be made easier from a privileged access perspective by implementing just-in-time access. So those DevSecOps engineers that were complaining about how difficult it was to use a password vault to check in and check out access to their recently spun up AWS instances, all that can be mitigated using the concepts of just-in-time access. So you can actually win over administrators into your good graces by implementing just-in-time access and making it easier for them to get their jobs done, while also mitigating the risk of lateral movement using compromised privileged access across the ecosystem. At the end of the day, it's making their jobs easier and less risky because none of them want to be the one whose account was compromised and used to cause difficulty and cause problems inside the enterprise. The other thing is that just-in-time access is actually probably a minimal behavior change for them to make as compared to implementing a password vault solution, which is going to significantly modify and impact their ability to get their jobs done. All right. Now you may be wondering, where do I start? Great. You've convinced me, Paul. Zero standing privilege is the thing I want. I've made all the core concepts behind zero standing privilege parts of my selection criteria for choosing a tool. I'm ready to start the project. Where do I start? And so the first step is really to think about, how do you rapidly assess the current state, right? How do you find out which admin credentials exist today? That is the first thing to answer for yourself, and the tool needs to support that as well. And then the second thing is, how do you protect them? And that's really where prioritizing the protection rollout comes in. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Prioritizing the protection rollout really comes down to a couple of different concepts. There's a lot of moving parts to track in all of this, honestly. So during the planning stage, you might want to be asking yourself and making sure that you know about what all of the IT assets in your ecosystem are. This turns out to be a very difficult problem to answer, even for medium-sized enterprises. So getting as much of a handle as you possibly can on what assets are out there is pretty important. Now, there's a reason why IT asset management is in the SANS top 5, and it has to do with exactly this problem, because you can't really prioritize different systems or different accounts if they're not on your radar already. So really making sure you've got a solid handle on the full set of IT assets is quite important. The next thing is to leverage any existing cybersecurity prioritization criteria. There's probably a matrix somewhere in your organization already that rates different systems or different accounts or different groups or different assets based on their internally assessed priority from a cybersecurity perspective. So feel free to borrow, steal, leverage that work as you start your PAM project. The next thing is to think about whether you've included the business's perspective. The reality is that in the world where more organizations are adopting cloud technology, the lines of business themselves are often running some of those technology solutions. And so incorporating them, folding them into the PAM project is a pretty critical part of having a successful PAM project. They may also be able to tell you about where privileged access exists that you didn't know about before, whether those are cloud systems that they're running or internally operated systems or vendor systems or partner systems. Incorporating the perspective of the business in your PAM project is really critical. And then also to think about DR and BCP. There are often DR and BCP plans that have something contemplating privileged access that the PAM projects may not know about until they go in and dig into that. And then the last suggestion I have here for the planning stage is to get really solid on who approves the exceptions. There's always going to be exceptions. There's exceptions to literally every rule. And understanding within your PAM program who it is that has the authority and the authorization to approve any exceptions to your policies around privileged access is a great thing to get settled way up front. So solve that before you start the project and you'll be a much happier crew. So who are the approvers and what is their review process? Great things to figure out ahead of time. All right, let's move on to the execution stage. You're all done with planning. You've got the perfect project plan. Now you're in execution stage. What are some things you might want to consider? What are some roadblocks you might want to anticipate? There's a couple of things you're really trying to do here. You're trying to achieve the project goals. That's fairly obvious. That's what execution is for. But you're also trying to prevent future backsliding. right? So today your privilege access management is in whatever state it's in. You're going to attain zero standing privilege, but you don't want to have to find out later on that you were fighting an uphill battle, and that as you were removing standing privilege access, other people were granting it. So here's some roadblocks to that you might want to consider. The first one is to ensure that all new computers, and that's virtual machines, laptops, desktops, if it runs an operating system, you should make sure that one of the first things you do is ensure that all the new ones of those things come with privilege access management already enabled. And however that works in your organization, make that a high priority. That way you're not running on a treadmill that's moving backwards for you. The next thing is to educate and influence and enforce the concept of principle of least privilege. It's often surprising how few people outside of information security teams understand the concepts of principle of least privilege, but it's a pretty basic concept. Once you explain it to folks and say what it is you're aiming for, this becomes a great communication tool, and users even pick up this language and think about principle of least privilege that they learned about from the PAM project in other parts of their job. So enforcing, educating, contemplating the principle of least privilege is a great thing to do to mitigate any roadblocks that you might anticipate. The next thing is to use automated policy enforcement to prevent backsliding. Like I mentioned, you don't want to be running uphill while the rocks are coming down at you. You want to be moving the whole project forward. So ensuring that once you've put systems into a mode with zero standing privilege, you want to continuously enforce that zero standing privilege. You don't want standing privilege access rights to sneak back into those systems. So using automated policy enforcement to enforce zero standing privilege is pretty critical to avoiding that kind of backsliding. And then track and publicize your journey toward zero standing privilege. It's a pretty easily digestible concept to say, yep, we had 21 million standing privilege rights. Now we're at 2 million, and soon we'll be at 0, right? Communicating that clearly and educating both internal teams, internal information security teams, and leadership teams around your journey toward zero standing privilege is a great communication tool, and probably should be one of your project's KPIs, and potentially one of your leadership's KPIs as well. All right, so let's fast forward. End of the project, everyone's eating cake at the project closeout day. What are some things you might want to be thinking about at that closeout stage? The first thing is to ensure that someone ideally in leadership, but definitely someone within the information security team, has the continuation of zero standing privilege as an annual goal. Because there are new and different ways that standing privilege can sneak into ecosystems every day, right? So multi-cloud scenarios, or different ways that standing privilege can sneak in that the IT team weren't anticipating, can be a real threat to your concept and your enforcement of zero standing privilege. So just make sure that forevermore someone has zero standing privilege as an annual or goal, or whatever frequency with which you evaluate corporate internal goals. Part of that is watching for new sources of privileged identities. I mentioned multi-cloud is one. There certainly are other possible sources of privileged identities, but anytime you're thinking or hearing about a new identity store being connected into your information ecosystem, think about what are the privileged identities in that directory, and how can we mitigate them and bring them to zero standing privilege as well. And then my last point here is just to integrate. Integrate. So historically, privilege access management has sort of been an island all by itself. It's been its little technology thing that just did password vaulting, and it didn't really interact with much else in the information security ecosystem. Those days are long past us. Privilege access management done well is not just integrated with your SIEM, it's not just integrated with your IGA, but it's integrated with lots of other tools across your information security ecosystem. Now, exactly which tools is going to be dependent on your particular environment, but the concept remains. Integration of privilege access management into a broader suite of information security tools is absolutely critical to the ongoing success of your privilege access management objectives. That's all I've got. I wanted to say thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very much reachable on Twitter. Drop me an email if you have any follow-up questions. It's been great getting to chat with you guys all today, and I wish you all luck in your privilege access management acceleration. Cheers.